Hi, my name is Gary Suri Curry. Sometimes everyone pays single decision, and right now, someone has already sent the bill.
Håkon Durtimer kneels in chains on the wet stone floor, lifting his swollen face through ragged breaths as Edmund Brickwood leans in with cold amusement. The dungeon stays silent except for metal clatter and Edmund's measured threat about the Middle Temple trial. Edmund Brickwood's expression hardens as he steps closer and speaks of execution and confiscation, while Håkon remains kneeling and silent beneath him. The nobleman's greed sharpens into open contempt as he prepares to claim the merchant guild. Edmund recoils after blood spatters his face, then drives his foot into Håkon's body with brutal contempt. Håkon absorbs the blows without a cry, tightening his jaw as Edmund's rage turns clumsy and loud. After Edmund leaves, Håkon remains alone in the darkness and slowly lifts his head, a thin smile forming through pain and exhaustion. His quiet laughter carries a hard, vengeful certainty as the dungeon closes around him. Jayan finds Dang No crouched behind a rock and calls him out, then lightly taps his back as the timid man flinches in panic. The hidden scout sphere gives way to trembling obedience while Jayan remains calm and controlled. Edmund finishes boasting about execution and seizure, while Durtimer stays kneeling in chains with a hard, silent stare. The dungeon feels tighter as Edmund's greed sharpens into certainty and Durtimer's restraint turns tense, as if he is measuring the nobleman's face before striking back. Edmund Brickwood's greed twists into fury as Durtimer's blood-mixed spit strikes his face. He draws back his heavy leg and drives a brutal stomp downward, while the chained merchant master braces on the floor with clenched teeth and defiant eyes. Edmund repeatedly stomps Durtimer's chest and side, then slows as his own breathing turns ragged. Durtimer absorbs the blows without a scream, jaw locked and eyes narrowed, while Edmund's anger drains into a staggered, irritated glare. Edmund stops kicking and leans back unsteadily, still glaring as he threatens to execute Durtimer and Jayan together. Durtimer remains on the floor, breathing hard through clenched teeth, his stillness carrying a cold, defiant refusal to break. After Edmund leaves, Durtimer is left alone in the dark and slowly lifts his head with a thin, dangerous smile. His quiet laughter carries a promise of revenge, and the empty dungeon seems to close around that resolve. Left alone behind the iron bars, Durtimer lifts his chin and lets a low laugh slip out, his tired face tightening into a cruel smile. In the silence, revenge hardens in his eyes as he stares into the darkness where Edmund vanished. After the chapter break, Jayan speaks calmly to Adelia and watches her rise with recovered strength. She answers softly, then freezes when she notices the adventurers' corpses around them, her relief turning into uneasy shock. Adelia slowly turns from the body's back toward Jayan, her lips parting as if to ask a question she cannot finish. Jayan remains composed and reassuring, letting the silence settle around her confusion. Jayan gives Adelia a brief command to retrieve the Earth Dragon's heart, and she obeys without protest. He then extracts the round core from the grotesque heart and places it into a box, his focus fixed and efficient. Later, Jayan searches the rocky, deep region and spots Dang No crouched behind a boulder, trembling in fear. He orders him out with a cool voice, then lightly taps his back, making the timid man flinch hard. Jayan, still composed after Adelia's guilty hesitation, gives a flat command and waits without moving. Adelia lowers her head, then turns toward the Earth Dragon's remains with disciplined resolve, her embarrassment giving way to obedience. Adelia completes the retrieval and places the Earth Dragon's heart at Jayan's feet, her face tight with effort. Jayan looks down at the grotesque mass, then bends toward it with controlled disgust, preparing to take it apart. Jayan suppresses his revulsion and rummages through the Earth Dragon's heart with both hands until he extracts the round core. His expression remains cool and focused, as if measuring the item's value rather than the grotesque texture around it. Jayan finishes by placing the Earth Dragon's heart into a box, sealing away the prize for later use. He straightens with quiet satisfaction, his expression calm and practical after securing the item. Jayan stood alone in the rocky deep region with a satisfied smile, his gold eyes narrowing as he weighed future growth and the trip to Verdas. He kept the sealed box close, already planning the next place to visit before dealing with the remaining trouble. After leaving the deeper path, Jayan scanned the rocks and quickly found Dang No crouched and trembling behind one of them. He called him out in a flat voice, then leaned in and lightly poked his back, making the frightened man jerk in panic. Dang No froze at the touch, his fear spilling into a shaky gasp as he remained half-hidden behind the rock. Jayan stayed close and steady, watching him with cool impatience while the timid scout struggled to rise from his crouch. Jayan kept his gaze on Dang No, recognizing the scout's instinctive caution aggression as something useful rather than pathetic. With the matter settled for the moment, he held his calm smile and prepared to move on, while Dang No remained shaken beside the rock. Jaein let out a brief laugh as he studied Dang No's crouched posture, realizing the man had not merely feared the Earth Dragon but had also sensed the approaching party and hidden in time. The discovery sharpened his interest because such survival instinct could be controlled and preserved until the ending. Dang No remained frozen behind the rock, his wary eyes fixed on Jaein as if measuring every breath and shift in distance. Jaein's quiet scrutiny only confirmed the scout's unusual ability, and the realization settled into a calm, possessive resolve to keep him close for the long game. Jaein kept watching in silence, convinced that Dang No's danger detection skill was the reason he could be managed with a single mandrake root. The thought deepened his determination, because a talent that could predict threats one step ahead was exactly the kind of ally he needed to carry into the late game. Inside the rattling carriage, Jaein softened his tone and answered Adelia's guilt without hesitation. Adelia kept her head bowed, then lifted both hands as he offered the violent dragon scale, her shame giving way to startled hope. Adelia's eyes widened as Jaein praised her reaction to the sword master's move. She tightened both hands around the violent dragon scale, her bowed posture easing as gratitude and disbelief replaced her earlier gloom. Jaein continued speaking with quiet certainty, explaining that the violent dragon had recognized Adelia's potential. Adelia listened in silence, her expression turning touched and steady as she held the metal-like scale close to her chest. Adelia finally accepted Jaein's reassurance and looked at him with renewed trust. She kept the violent dragon scale in both hands, her posture straightening as the carriage continued to shake toward Verdes. Jaein answered Adelia's question with measured calm, admitting only that his connection to the violent dragon was long-standing. His vague tone kept her curiosity alive, while her expression tightened with cautious surprise as she listened beside him in the rattling carriage. Adelia stared at the scale in her hands, then lifted her gaze toward Jaein and asked about his relationship with the violent dragon nymph. Her voice carried uncertainty and earnestness, while Jaein remained composed, giving her only a guarded, incomplete answer. Jaein continued in the same even voice, saying the explanation was complicated and that they had known each other for a long time. Adelia absorbed the answer in silence, her guarded expression softening into puzzled acceptance as the carriage swayed onward. Adelia fell quiet after hearing that they had known each other for a long time, her curiosity lingering but her posture easing. Jaein stayed steady beside her, leaving the matter unresolved as the carriage continued to rattle toward Verdes. Jaein kept his voice steady and told Adelia she no longer needed to doubt herself, adding that even the violent dragon had acknowledged her talent. Adelia's expression softened with visible relief, and she answered that she would remember it, while Jaein's subtle smile hid his private resolve to keep shaping her into a dependable ally. Adelia absorbed Jaein's reassurance with a touched, earnest look and gave him a quiet promise to keep it in mind. Jaein remained composed across from her, his calm expression and faint smile making the cramped carriage feel briefly gentler as the ride continued. Jaein held his subtle smile a moment longer, privately deciding to keep feeding Adelia encouragement and elixirs so she would remain loyal and grow into a future powerhouse. Adelia, still visibly moved, watched him with trusting eyes as the carriage rattled onward toward Verdes. The Earth Dragon's head crashed onto the guild floor with a thunderous impact, and Jaein stood unmoving as the hall fell into stunned silence. Adelia, beside him, brushed grime from her hands with a composed face while the surrounding adventurers stared in disbelief. Whispers spread through the guild as Adelia kept her posture steady, her calm expression contrasting with the crowd's disbelief. Jaein remained beside her, receiving the attention that shifted from her to him as the room continued to murmur around the proof of their victory. A trembling guild employee confirmed the monster's identity and handed over the advance payment, and on the heavy money pouch without changing his expression. Adelia remained at his side, quiet and alert, as the guild's shock settled into uneasy respect. Jaein held the money pouch at his side and turned his attention away from the crowd, already focused on the next matter waiting in the city. The guild's noise faded behind him as he stood composed, ready to move on immediately. Returning to the inn, Jaein received Mrs. Dirtimer's tearful plea with a cold, steady gaze. She clutched at his attention while stammering about the Eastern Merchant Guild and her husband, and he answered by directing her toward the Brickwood residence, already resolved to cut out the city's corruption. Mrs. Dirtimer's fear deepened as Jaein's answer settled into a grim plan. Before she could recover, heavy footsteps and clanking armor approached from outside, and both of them turned toward the sound as Brickwood knights entered the inn with hostile purpose. Jaein judged the knights' arrogance without hesitation and gave Adelia the order to kill them all. Mrs. Dirtimer recoiled at the threat, while the armed men froze at the edge of the room, their confidence breaking as the confrontation turned irreversible. Adelia answered Jaein's command with swift, precise violence, and the knights collapsed one after another under her blade. Mrs. Dirtimer turned away in horror as Jaein stood before her, floor, unmoved, watching the final resistance break apart in the inn's cramped front room. Jayan steadied Mrs. Durtimer with a calm voice as she trembled against his sleeve, then kept his gaze on the approaching knights. He held Adelia back with a firm, outstretched hand, choosing restraint while he measured the soldiers' arrogance and prepared to question them first. Jayan answered the lead knight's challenge without raising his voice, declaring that he had already subjugated the Earth Dragon. The arrogant soldier's confidence faltered into disbelief, and the surrounding knights reacted with open laughter, exposing their contempt and making their ignorance immediately clear. Jayan listened to the knights' laughter and recognized their cruelty when they boasted about torturing Durtimer and demolishing the guild. Mrs. Durtimer's fear deepened, while Adelia stayed poised beside him, waiting for his decision as he concluded that negotiation had become pointless. Adelia moved first when Jayan gave the order, drawing her sword into a lethal line as the knights' laughter broke into panic. Mrs. Durtimer turned away in fear, and Jayan remained still beside her, watching the clash with a cold, measured expression. Jayan held his ground before the inn entrance, his expression cold as he measured the knight's mockery. Beside him, Adelia steadied Mrs. Durtimer after the woman's knees gave way, and the older woman's face slackened with shock and grief. Mrs. Durtimer's strength failed completely as the knight's words sank in, and she folded toward the floor in a stunned collapse. Adelia reacted at once, tightening her support and lifting the woman back against her shoulder, while Jayan watched the exchange with a hard, unblinking stare. Jayan answered the knights with a flat accusation, naming the torture of the guild master as the line they had crossed. Adelia kept Mrs. Durtimer upright at his side, while the woman remained shaken and barely able to stand. Adelia tightened her hold on Mrs. Durtimer as the knight's cruelty became undeniable, her face sharpening into cold resolve. Jayan remained beside them, steady and unreadable, while the woman leaned heavily into Adelia's support and struggled to recover her breath. Jayan briefly lowers his gaze, then lifts it with a flat, final calm as he decides the knights are beyond negotiation. Adelia stands ready beside Mrs. Durtimer, and the woman remains rigid with fear while the knight's mocking laughter hangs in the doorway. Jayan gives the order in a quiet voice, and Adelia answers at once, her posture sharpening into lethal readiness. Mrs. Durtimer recoils in place as the knights freeze at the threshold, their confidence breaking for a moment under the sudden command. Adelia moves first, and the nearest knight's warning is cut short as her blade flashes through the air. Jayan stays motionless beside Mrs. Durtimer, watching the opening strike without surprise while the woman turns pale at the sudden violence. Adelia follows through with another precise cut, forcing the knights back as their formation collapses at the inn entrance. Jayan remains composed in the center, and Mrs. Durtimer turns her face away, unable to bear the sight of the escalating clash. Adelia completes the first killing stroke, her cold face unchanged as the nearest knight's body recoils and the others stare in shock. Jayan remains still beside Mrs. Durtimer, who has already begun to turn her face away from the violence. Adelia shifts her weight and drives a second emerald-lit slash through the clustered knights, who scramble to raise their swords too late. Mrs. Durtimer squeezes her eyes shut and turns farther aside, while Jayan watches without changing his expression. Adelia continues forward with another precise cut, and the remaining knights lose their formation as their weapons slip from their grasp. Jayan stays impassive in the background, while Mrs. Durtimer keeps her back half-turned, refusing to look. Adelia finishes another cold, efficient motion as the last visible resistance collapses around her. Mrs. Durtimer keeps her eyes shut and turns fully aside, and Jayan continues to observe the aftermath with the same calm, unreadable composure. Jayan remains motionless as the slaughter settles, his expression unchanged while Adelia stands ready beside him. Mrs. Durtimer stays turned away, shaken but silent, as the inn's front area falls into a tense, bloodless stillness after the final exchange. Jayan halts the killing with a single command, and Adelia's blade stops beside him as the last knight crawls away on the blood-dark dirt. Jayan's expression stays cold and controlled while he advances toward the wounded man, anger sharpening into quiet contempt. Jayan closes the distance and speaks with icy disdain, forcing the knight to confront his own cowardice instead of Brickwood's name. The man's bloodshot panic rises as Jayan reaches for his weapon, and Adelia watches from behind him, still and ready. Jayan finishes drawing the feather blade and delivers his final rebuke, making it clear that Brickwood's name offers no protection here. Adelia remains motionless behind him, her posture disciplined as the knight's fear peaks under Jayan's calm advance. Jayan completes the execution in one decisive motion, and the knight's resistance ends beneath the silent weight of his judgment. Adelia holds her position beside him, her face unreadable as the inn's bloody ground falls still around them. Jayan completes the final cut with a calm, exact motion, and the last knight's body slackens to the floor. He lowers his sword, expression unreadable, as the violence settles into a cold silence around him. The scene shifts to the black marble reception room, where Edmund Brickwood forces an awkward smile and gestures toward the sofa for his guest. Jayan stands stands opposite him with quiet, unreadable poise, making the room feel tighter and more oppressive than its luxury suggests. Seekin Bauer settles onto the sofa with rigid authority, and Edmund's smile tightens as he continues his nervous hospitality. The Inquisitor's cold stare and still posture make Edmund's deference look increasingly desperate. Jayan enters alone, and Edmund's confusion hardens as he realizes the knights never returned. Seekin rises in sudden agitation, while Edmund stands trapped between the two men, his composure collapsing under the silence. Edmund Brickwood stiffens beside the sofa, his hands rubbing together at chest height as he forces out a strained apology. Seekin Bauer remains seated to the left, his cold stare fixed on Edmund's face, making the room feel tighter and more hostile. Seekin Bauer cuts off Edmund's vulgar offer with a severe rebuke, his expression unmoved as he questions the delay in capturing the mastermind. Edmund recoils a half-step, his shoulders tightening and his palms freezing mid-rub, visibly shaken by the Inquisitor's contempt. Edmund Brickwood nervously explains that a report of Jayan's sighting arrived only minutes earlier, and that the timing prevented him from confirming the situation. Seekin Bauer listens without softening, his posture unchanged and his gaze still sharp enough to pin Edmund in place. Seekin Bauer holds Edmund under a hard, unblinking stare as the explanation ends, while Edmund's hands slow and his posture collapses into uneasy stillness. The reception room remains immaculate and soundless, its luxury now feeling like a sealed chamber for judgment. Edmund Brickwood stiffens in his seat as the reception room door begins to open, his irritation collapsing into alarm. Seekin Bauer remains seated beside him, chin lifted and eyes fixed on the doorway, waiting in cold silence for the interruption. Jayan steps into the room alone, his calm face unreadable as Edmund's anger turns to confusion. Seekin Bauer's posture tightens, while Edmund leans forward toward the doorway, staring at the unexpected visitor and the empty space behind him. Edmund blurts out his question about the knights, but Jayan answers that they are all dead. Seekin rises sharply from the sofa, his stern composure breaking into visible agitation as the room's tension hardens around Edmund. Jayan repeats that every knight is dead, leaving Edmund frozen and pale while Seekin turns his gaze directly onto him. The silence between them becomes a verdict, and Edmund's forced composure finally fails under the pressure. Jayan stands motionless at the doorway, his calm golden gaze fixed on Edmund while Seekin remains seated to the right. Edmund's suspicion hardens as he studies Jayan's untouched appearance, and the room's tense silence deepens around the three men. Edmund's expression shifts from smug certainty to uneasy calculation as he notices Jayan's unmarked condition. He leans forward a fraction, searching for signs of a struggle that are not there, while Seekin watches in cold silence from the sofa. Jayan answers Edmund's unspoken doubt with a flat declaration that the knights are dead. The words strike the room like a blade, and Edmund's face tightens as Seekin's posture shifts from stillness to alert attention. Seekin rises fully and turns his stern gaze on Edmund, demanding the truth with icy authority. Edmund falters under the pressure, while Jayan stays composed at center frame, letting the accusation settle without moving. Jayan answers in a flat, chilling voice that the knights are dead, and Edmund's anxious face tightens as the implication lands. Seekin remains upright beside him, his expression hardening while the room's heavy silence presses Edmund into stillness. Jayan adds that it was not one knight but all of them, and Edmund's forced composure begins to crack. Seekin's attention shifts sharply toward Edmund, his agitation rising as the accusation settles into the room like a weight. Seekin slowly rises to full height and demands that Jayan repeat himself, his cold authority turning the room heavier. Edmund tries to answer, but his smile fails as Seekin's gaze locks onto him with unmistakable suspicion. Seekin turns his gaze fully onto Edmund and orders silence, demanding the knight's whereabouts with icy precision. Edmund falls mute under the accusation, and Jayan holds his ground without moving, leaving Edmund cornered by his own silence. Seekin straightened in the damp chamber and declared that the trial would begin at once, his stern face fixed on Edmund. Jayan remained still beside him, while Edmund stiffened under the verdict's weight, the dungeon's blood-stained air pressing in around them. The dungeon doors opened, and Håkon Dirtimer was brought forward from the darkness, his body unsteady but upright after the chains fell away. He lifted his head with a low, bitter laugh, then fixed his tired eyes on Edmund and Jayan as if measuring the moment he had waited for. Håkon raised one hand and pointed directly at Edmund, naming him as the one who destroyed the guild and tortured innocents. Edmund snapped back in fury, but Seekin's cold command cut him off, and the accusation settled into the room like a final nail. Seekin closed his eyes for a brief moment, then pronounced Edmund Brickwood guilty and sentenced him to immediate execution. Before Edmund could recover from the shock, the sentence was carried out, and the chamber fell into stunned silence. Edmund's head rolled across the cold floor as the execution ended, leaving his body out of balance and the room emptied of his authority. Seekin stood over the judgment with unshaken composure, while Jayan and Håkon remained fixed in place, each absorbing the finality of the scene. Seekin held Jayan's Jayan's gaze in rigid silence, then gave a small nod and turned away with measured restraint. Dirtimer remained beside the reopened guild entrance, watching the Inquisitor leave with a hard, relieved expression as the city's judgment finally loosened. Later, Dirtimer stood at the guild entrance and promised to rebuild everything, his voice steady despite the long strain behind his eyes. Jayan listened without moving, then answered with quiet approval, leaving Dirtimer visibly resolved as the first cautious townspeople returned. By evening, Jayan and Adelia stood together in the quiet city, watching Verdas settle into an uneasy peace. Adelia asked whether it was over, and Jayan answered that it was only over for them, leaving her thoughtful as night deepened around them. Night fell fully over Verdas, and Jayan remained beside Adelia as the city stayed quiet without fear. He looked ahead with controlled certainty while she stood at his side, the absence of corruption giving the streets a rare, clean stillness.